Derek Penslar is the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History and the Director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Harvard University. He has published a dozen books, most recently Theodore Herzl, The Charismatic Leader, 2020, and Zionism, An Emotional State, 2023. He is currently writing a book titled The War for Palestine, 1947-1949, A Global History. He is a past president of the American Academy for Jewish Research, a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and an honorary fellow at St. John's College, Oxford. Quite frankly, I can't think of anyone anywhere more qualified to talk to us about the history of Zionism than Derek. And so much more could be said about Derek's academic work and his approach, but having a brief bio gives me a chance just to say something sort of more personal, because this is not Derek's first time in front of the DJC. In the past years, when Derek was based at U of T, he took time to present to the DJC Book Club on a number of occasions, and this included leading us through works by such authors as David Grossman and Amos Oz. And if I'm making that up, just I think that's true. And then I might add, just in, yeah, and then
Yes, we're very happy to have him.
and in terms of continuity, I might just add that among the works that we studied was a profound, disturbing, and funny novel written by Philip Roth about 30 years ago, entitled Operation Shylock, which quite interestingly deals with Israel, Palestine, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and many of the themes that relate to tonight. So basically, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Derek to continue to talk with us. It's been a very difficult time. We feel especially honored to have you with us because you have a busy schedule. Derek is like literally back from Israel hours ago, and so if he's talking in the wrong direction or something, it's the flight change. But anyways, we're lucky to have him, and welcome, Derek.
Thank you, Michael, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. And yeah, I'm a little fairblunget because it's like 3 in the morning for me, and it's also about 22 degrees Celsius. So this is a little different, but yeah, it has been a very strange last 15 months for all of us, and I know that as controversial, as difficult as it's always been to have a connection with Israel, to call yourself a Zionist or an anti-Zionist or a non-Zionist or a counter-Zionist, whatever term you want to use, it's become more controversial, more fraught in the last 15 months or so. So I've got a tall order tonight. I'm going to try to talk both about what the major issues are that really impede any kind of, I would say, healthy conversation about Israel-Palestine, and then I'll move on and try to provide a bit of a narrative history with an emphasis on the key points of division, the things that people argue about. In addition to writing and teaching about Israel-Palestine, I've also been co-chair of the Harvard Task Force on Anti-Semitism, who's been working on a book-length report, and it's just really working on this problem of how people either can't or won't talk to each other in a civil way about this particular subject. It's fascinating, but it's also kind of frustrating. And if I can also ask people just to turn off their phones. In Israel, it's a lost cause, but do Jews have a right, a legitimate claim on a homeland in Palestine? Do they? And a lot of Jews in the world say yes, they do, and there are scores, if not hundreds of millions of Christians who say yes. There's far more people in the world today who would say no. They don't have that right. Do Palestinians, that is the term that's been used since the 1970s, really, to describe Arabs of Palestine. It's interesting how in 1948, at the United Nations, Arab diplomats usually referred to the Arabs of Palestine as opposed to the Palestinians, but the term Palestinian has become ubiquitous. Do they have a right to self-determination, after all, in a land where they had lived for, or their ancestors had lived for centuries? Who's right, who's wrong? Or is it possible for both people to be right? As the late author Amos Oz famously said, this is a clash between right and right. Well, that's a view that a lot of people in the world don't want to accept. They believe that there's very clearly a right and a wrong. So that basic question of legitimacy. Another question, another fundamental issue whenever we talk about Israel-Palestine is the aftermath of 1948, when the state was created. I'll talk about that in a historical narrative in a little while. But the question of the approximately 750,000 Palestinians who were dispossessed in 1948, who fled in panic or who were expelled outright from their homes, what rights do they have? Do they have a right to return to their homes? Should they be settled somewhere else? What about Jews from Middle Eastern countries who were persecuted and then who wound up in the state of Israel? Does the international community owe anything to them? Ongoing problem. The question of do the Palestinians have a right to return? Do the Jews have a right to return to what is, in the Jewish tradition, the Jewish ancestral homeland of the land of Israel? How do you solve the problem? Should there be two states in historic Palestine, the land between the Jordan and the Mediterranean? Should there be two states, one Palestinian and one Jewish? Should there be one state, all Jewish, all the Palestinians leave, all Arab, all the Jews leave? Dominated by Jews, Arabs are subordinate. Dominated by Jews, Arabs are subordinate. Right? Those are the options. And we'll talk about how in history those are the options that keep on coming up over and over again. Not long after October 7th, I gave a talk at Tufts University. It was a very raw period. We were all, at least people in my world, were processing the grief about the tragic massacre led by Hamas that killed 1,200 individuals. But the crowd was mostly composed of pro-Palestinian young people who said over and over again that Israel was a colonial settler apartheid state. And I said to them, well, usually I would argue with you, but tonight I'm not going to. I'm going to say, okay, you're right, fine. Now what? All right, there's 7 million Jews, there's 7 million Palestinians between the river and the sea. You can call Israel whatever you want. Not going anywhere. What are you going to do about it? One state, two states, no state. And if that weren't all enough, the question of the fate of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, which is holy to something like half of humanity. When you add up all the Christians, all the Muslims, and that little teeny pocket of Jews, 1/5 of 1% of the world's population. It's really amazing when you think about that. What will be the fate of Jerusalem, which is now a unified city under Israeli sovereignty? Palestinians claim the eastern part for their own, and then the clash over the old city is just very hard to resolve. The old city, and in particular the Temple Mount, the area that Jews know as the Temple Mount, the site of the ancient temples, and the area that the entire Muslim world calls Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, the site of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, structures that date back to the 7th century CE. Next slide, please. It's so controversial, and I'm teaching a course on Israel-Palestine starting in about a week, that even what we call the region, even the most basic terms we use, are going to be controversial. Do we call the region Israel? Well, Israel is not a place, right? Israel is it's a name of a people. Israel was, after all, the second name of the patriarch Jacob, after he wrestled with the angel at the Jabbok River in the book of Genesis. To be the children of Israel is to be descended from a human being, and Israel means the land of Israel, the land of the children of Jacob. Well, if we call it Israel, or the land of Israel, Eretz Israel, that's a Jewish claim. What else can we call it? Well, the term that's been used throughout the world ever since late antiquity is Palestine. Palestina, one form or another, Philistine in Arabic, and that's what it's been called throughout the world for a couple of thousand years. In the Christian world, it's known as the Holy Land, Terra Sancta, the Holy Land. And there is an Arabic translation as well. Just take the Holy Land, put it into Arabic, and some people use that term. So if we call it Israel, we're making a political statement. If we call it Palestine, we may or may not be making a political statement. It's gotten to the point that academics in general now refer to it as Israel-Palestine, with a slash, not a hyphen. You can go to war over hold on, you're the editor. It's not a diacritical mark. It's not a punctuation mark. What do you call it? No, but like a slash and a hyphen are both blanks. Things, okay. Things. So, because if you say Israel hyphen Palestine, it's like Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina or something, or Czechoslovakia. You know, two places right next to each other. If you say Israel slash Palestine, you're acknowledging that this entire territory could be Palestine, could be Israel. We don't want to argue about it. Let's move on to the next thing, right? So we call it Israel-Palestine. What do we call the dispute? Well, I grew up, and it was the Arab-Israeli conflict, because I grew up in the world of 1967 war, 1973 war. Israel fought other Arab states, so it was the Arab-Israeli conflict. Well, Israel hasn't really fought a war against an Arab state in a half century. They fought wars against Palestinian factions, they fought wars against Lebanese factions, but they haven't really fought a war against a state. So the more common name became the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that's the term that's been used from the 1980s until very recently. However, among left-wing circles that are quite pro-Palestinian, I've been told that this term is not acceptable. The belief being that a conflict assumes equality between the parties. You can't call it a war for that reason, or a conflict. I think this is nonsense. I mean, Andrew Mack, Asymmetric Warfare, 1975. You can have stronger sides and weaker sides and still have a war. And I think this idea that conflict should not be used because of the power disparities between the two parties is kind of silly, but there are people who insist on calling it the Israeli-Palestinian struggle. The idea being that Palestinians are struggling for liberation. Well, I think it's a conflict. It's a conflict with unequally powerful sides, but it's a conflict. But anyway, and what do we call the actors? Now, this is really complicated historically. Until 1948, there was no state of Israel. So what do we call the Jews who lived there? We could say the Jews versus the Arabs, okay? Well, some of those Jews who lived in what became the state of Israel were anti-Zionist, right? They were Orthodox Jews who did not believe in Zionism. You know, what do we call them? So do we say Jews versus Arabs? Do we say Israelis versus Palestinians? 22% of Israel's citizens are not Jewish. Actually, 25%. Most of them are Arab. And some of them want to be called Israeli Palestinians. Some of them want to be called Israeli Arabs. Some of them want to be called 1948 Palestinians. So it gets to a point now where I meet a Palestinian, I say, what do you want me to call you? It's like your pronouns, right? What do you want to be called? I'll call you whatever you want. Okay. So the most basic vocabulary is fraught. The second you open your mouth, you identify yourself. You say Israel, you say Palestine, you say conflict, you say struggle. Next slide, please. So, you know, the region I referred to earlier, historic Palestine, the land of Israel, the state of Israel, which only has existed since 1948, which is recognized by most of the countries in the world, 165 out of 193, but then there's the state of Palestine. You know, in the Jewish community, there are many people who tell me there's no such thing as Palestine. Well, tell that to 138 countries in the world which recognize the state of Palestine. It's aspirational, to be sure, but 138 out of 193 UN member states recognize. I think it's up to 196, 141 now. And I mentioned earlier the question of the punctuation. And yeah, what do we call it? A war, a conflict, a struggle? I guess I'm getting a little ahead of myself there. Is it a conflict between two equal parties, Jews, Israelis, whatever, Palestinians, like this? Or is it a colonial conflict, as many critics of Israel would say, where the Israelis have the position of a colonial power that came in, Jews took Palestinian land, and the Palestinians are trying to liberate themselves from Israeli hegemony. So you can see it as a conflict between two parties that are more or less the same, nationalities fighting over the same land, or often in anti-Israel circles, is seen as a colonial conflict. And then the final thing I have to bring up, in May of 2024, there was a encampment at Harvard for about 3 weeks. About 60 students pitched tents, and they basically took up a big chunk of Harvard Yard. And there was a sign up in the encampment that said, "It's not complex." Because complexity has become a kind of a dirty word. for people who favor the Palestinian cause. The idea being it's not complex. There's a colonizing, invading force that took Palestinian land, and they shouldn't be there. And the Palestinians have a right to liberate themselves, and that's it. It's not complex. And I tell my students on the first day of class, sorry, folks, it is complex. I mean, even if your sympathies, whatever your sympathies might be, it is complex. We probably, with the Jewish crowd, how many physicians do we have? Okay, I'm sure we have. Well, you're just embarrassed to admit it because you don't want to be called in case somebody has a problem. Is there a physician in the synagogue? You know, if you're a physician, you know illness is complex, okay? If you're a psychologist, we've got to have some psychologists in the room, social workers, right? You know, people are complex. Israel-Palestine is complex. So, next slide. And then, you know, the actors, I guess I already talked about this a little bit. Are they Arabs and Israelis? Are they Jews and Arabs and so forth? How and when do we use the term Zionism and so forth? And the fact is, not only are there non-Jewish citizens of Israel, there are in Israel Jews who reject the term Zionist. I gave a bunch of talks in Israel the last 2 weeks, and I was talking to a group of young teachers, and one of them just said, look, I'm an anti-Zionist. I mean, we're here, and the state of Israel exists, but I just don't believe in the principles of Zionism, that we have certain rights and claims on this land that the Arabs don't. You know, it's like, okay, he's not a Zionist. Other people in the room said they were Zionists. So you can be a Jew, and you can be a citizen of Israel, and you can be secular, you can be religious, you can be Zionist, you can be anti-Zionist. All of these things are hugely controversial. Okay, next slide. Now, this question about colonization is something I really have to hone in on, because about 50 years ago, scholars began to write about the nature of Zionism. Is it colonial? Is it not colonial? After all, not all the Jews who came to the land of Israel were from Europe, but many of them were, and many of them had ideas of civilizational superiority over the Palestinians. And after all, Zionism hooked up with Britain as a colonial power. It seems like a colonial movement. Settlers came, worked the land. The Arabs were driven out or not allowed to return after 1948. And the Palestinian response was that they were the native people of Palestine, or to use a word that's become extremely widely used in the last 10 years or so, or 20 years, indigenous. And this argument about indigeneity, who's indigenous to Palestine, it's a raging controversy. Palestinians say they are the indigenous people of Palestine. We began with a land acknowledgement here. So there's, in Canada, as we all know, there's a lot of concern about the issue of indigenous peoples, First Nations. This issue just permeates the controversies about Israel-Palestine. So I've reproduced a rabbinic text, or a couple of rabbinic texts. First, Rashi's commentary on Genesis 1:1. You know, in the beginning, what is the reason why Scripture commences with the account of creation? And it's really because God created the universe so that it could have Torah. And who has the Torah? The Jews. And this is so that when the Jews come and take the land of Israel, they will not say to them, Listimatem, you are robbers. You took by force the lands of the 7 nations of Canaan. Israel may reply to them, all the earth belongs to the Holy One, blessed be He. He created it and gave it to whom He pleased. When He willed, He gave it to them, and when He willed, He took it from them and gave it to us. So this very classic rabbinic dictum acknowledges, you see it in the Bible itself, Jews originated with Abraham up in Mesopotamia. They became a people in Egypt, according to the biblical account. They conquered Canaan. In the biblical account, they drove out the pre-existing people, and the Jewish rabbinic tradition is fine with that. It's like, yeah, that's what happened, because it was our promised land. It's much harder for secular Jews in the 20th and 21st century to sort of get their heads around this, The biblical and the rabbinic account is very simple. So then the question is, who's indigenous? In the Jewish tradition, the Jews are not indigenous to the land of Israel. I cannot tell you how many times I've been told, you didn't tell me this, but when I'm about to give a synagogue talk, you will say that the Jews are indigenous to the land of Israel, won't you? Because the attacks against Jews as being colonial invaders has elicited a desire by Jews who are connected to Israel to say, no, we are indigenous. Next slide, please. So I saw on a website a few years ago this ad for what's called Judean clothing. Authentic clothing worn by ancient Judeans thousands of years ago. It's not a keffiyeh. No. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, not back, please. Yeah. This language of Jewish indigeneity has really mushroomed in the last few years precisely as people who support Israel are feeling more and more attacked, right, by pro-Palestinian activists who are asserting, now we, the Palestinians, are indigenous. We have the same basic fate as indigenous peoples in Canada, the United States, the Aboriginals of Australasia. You are the colonists, right, from Europe. And so one response from Israelis has been, no, we are indigenous. And for anyone who's interested in this, there's a great new book by Rachel Feldman, very smart anthropologist, where she writes about how settlers on the West Bank have constructed a very elaborate narrative of indigeneity. They have returned to their land, and they have, as it were, it's like 2,000 years have gone by in an instant. The fact is, according to the Jewish tradition, Jews are not indigenous. They originated, again, in Mesopotamia, in Egypt. They were promised the land of Israel. They conquered the land of Israel. They lived there for a long time. They were driven out, right? So indigeneity is a very postmodern 21st century argument that is not part of the Jewish religious tradition. And the settler leadership, after 1967, the settlers who took the who started settling the West Bank, one of their leaders said, "Of course we're not indigenous. If all we were is indigenous, we'd be like the Native Americans. We wouldn't be special in any way. We would just be natives. We're not natives. We're the chosen people of God. God gave us this land." So it's interesting how the leaders of the West Bank settlement movement back then were saying we're not indigenous. Today they're saying they are indigenous. Next slide. The whole question of Jewish indigeneity hides a much deeper and more interesting subject, which is, are the Jews foreigners to the land of Israel? Are they foreigners to the Middle East? Well, look, before the Holocaust, 90% of world Jewry was Ashkenazic. That is, either living in or originating in Northern and Eastern Europe. 90% of Jews. Yiddish was their native tongue for most of them. For some it was Hungarian, for some it was Polish or Russian. In North America, in 1948, half of the Jews in North America had been born in Eastern Europe and spoke Yiddish. That faded away over time. There were 8% of world Jewry lived in the Middle East. 8%. Today you wouldn't know that because there's, I think, a great deal of interest in Middle Eastern Jewry, but only 8% of world Jewry in the 1930s lived in MENA, Middle East and North Africa. So the fact is that Jews were predominantly an Ashkenazic people, but Palestine historically did have a Middle Eastern Jewish presence. Now, it was small, a few thousand. In the 19th century, Orthodox Jews from Europe began to move there, but again, very small population. During the 1920s, Jews from Europe began to move to Palestine in large numbers. But after the State of Israel was created in the 1950s, early 50s, came a great migration from the Middle East and North Africa. And when you look at Israel today, it's about 40% Mizrahi, that is Jews of MENA, Middle East, North African origin, about 10% Sephardic, which is not the same thing. Sephardic Jews are Jews who descended from the Iberian Peninsula, from Spain and Portugal, and a lot of them wound up in the Balkans, and their native language was not Arabic. Their native language was Ladino, which is a form of Spanish and Portuguese. So when you look at the state of Israel today, you see a state that is largely Middle Eastern demographically, and even more so when you look at marriage rates. So more and more Israelis are, quote, in mixed marriages, which means not Jews and Arabs, but Jews of Ashkenazic and, let's say, Mizrahi origin. So, are the Jews in Israel today foreigners? Are they Europeans? I heard during the student demonstrations in the last year, I heard pro-Palestinians shout, "Go back to Poland," which is kind of interesting for some Jew whose ancestors came from Morocco, or from Iraq, or from Yemen. Besides, Poland didn't really want the Jews back after 1945, and I don't think they want them back now. So anyway, next slide, please. So these are just some of the big issues. And what I'm going to try to do now is flesh them out with some historical narrative, because I've been talking now in very broad terms. So I'm going to just offer some historical narrative. So I've been talking for about 25 minutes. I'll talk for another 20, 25. Okay. Was Palestine, when Zionists first came to the land of Israel / Palestine, was it an Arab land? Well, they had about 400,000 people, of whom 25,000 were Jews. So it was overwhelmingly Arab. The city of Jaffa, here, the largest city in Palestine, was an Arab commercial entrepot. Most of the Jews who came to Palestine in the 1880s and 90s actually lived in Jaffa, and they worked as merchants. Next slide, please. Jerusalem had the largest Jewish population in terms of proportion. That is, Jews were a majority of Jerusalem's population back then in the late 1800s. Remember, Jerusalem then just consisted of the old city and a few neighborhoods outside of it. But it was very much an Arab environment. Jerusalem, Jaffa, the other major cities of Palestine. And Zionists would say that it was a wasteland, that it was thinly populated and so forth. Well, actually, Palestine back then was pretty well developed. The population density of Palestine under Ottoman rule in around 1900 was about the same as Lebanon. And Lebanon was pretty well developed at that time. Just to give you some numbers, because I'm a nerd, if you haven't noticed. Not yet. I didn't say next slide. I said I'm a nerd. Okay. There were about 2 million people in New Jersey in 1900. Now, New Jersey is the same size as the state of Israel. And there were about 400,000 or 500,000 in Palestine. Remember that half of Palestine is just desert. The Negev desert back then was virtually uninhabited. So, sure, it was less inhabited than New Jersey. But New Jersey was an industrialized, urbanized part of the United States. Massachusetts, I always forget where I am because I teach at Harvard, but I'm here. Massachusetts also had a somewhat larger population. By Middle Eastern standards, Palestine was not that thinly populated. Next slide. So, was Zionism then at its core a desire to, as it were, develop an underpopulated, underdeveloped land, or was it something else? Zionism really begins for reasons that have nothing to do with Palestine. When the word Zionism was coined, by around 1890, it was coined by a young journalist who used the word to describe a kind of Jewish ethnic awareness. To be a Zionist was like to be a proud Frenchman or a proud German or a proud Italian. To be a Zionist was to be a member of the Jewish nation. That's really what he meant. But alongside of that idea was a movement that had begun a decade earlier, in the early 1880s, called the Lovers of Zion, Chovevei Zion. A very interesting term, that the very first form of modern Jewish attachment to the land of Israel was through the emotion of love. Chovevei Zion, lovers of Zion. Chiba in Hebrew is a special kind of love. Ahava is love, broadly speaking. Chiba is endearment. Chiba is what you feel towards a child, or towards a pet, or towards a friend whom you hold dear. It's a very sentimental term. and it really ties in with 19th century European sentimental literature. So to be called a Chovev Tzion actually means something. So you have a kind of secular Jewish nationalism, but you also have a small body of maybe 15,000 Jews throughout the whole world in the 1880s who belong to little organizations called Lovers of Zion. They are not the Zionists we think of. They didn't even use the word Zionist. So who popularized the word Zionist? A secular Jewish journalist from Budapest who moved to Vienna in his teens, became a lawyer, hated being a lawyer. Any of you lawyers out there, take note, right? And became a journalist and playwright, experienced a crisis of consciousness in his mid-30s, was looking for a project in life and something that would give him meaning. And so Theodor Herzl moved from a career as a B-plus journalist to a great political visionary and leader. And he founded the Zionist organization. He convened a series of Zionist congresses in Switzerland and then other cities. And he is the man we usually think of as the founder of modern Zionism, although there had been various predecessors. So the point is that none of this really, for Herzl at least, had much to do with Palestine. He only went to Palestine once in his life, in 1898, for 10 days, like birthright, right? And he didn't like it very much. He said it was dirty and old, and he didn't have the kind of fun that kids have on birthright today. So Zionism, in its early instances, was about many things. Ethnic pride, yes. A connection with the land of Israel, yes. Next slide, please. And yes, for some, immigration, for some. Now let me get this clear. Between the 1880s and 1920, about 2 million Jews left Europe. 2 million. Of that 2 million, about 50,000 wound up in Palestine. Where did the rest go? United States, some wound up here, Latin America to some extent, Western Europe, 50,000 out of 2 million. Who were these people? For the most part, they were simply immigrants. They were poor Jews looking for better economic opportunity. They were poor, they were persecuted in Eastern Europe. They were not idealistic Zionists. They were just Jews. Now, why did they wind up in Palestine and not in America? I don't know, maybe they had an uncle in Palestine. They'd heard there was work there. They liked the weather. Or it was cheaper. It was much cheaper to get a ship from Odessa to Palestine than, go through, steal across the border, get to Hamburg or Bremen or something, and then get on the ship to New York. There was a small minority of Jews from Eastern Europe, for the most part, who were idealistic Zionists. These are the people we think of as Zionists, or as the Jews who came to Palestine in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. There was actually a pretty small group. And here we see the pioneer youth around 1920. They were very young. Whenever I teach my undergraduates, I tell them that they were the age of undergraduates today. 17, 18, 19 years old, filled with radical and revolutionary ideology, determined to build themselves and to build the land, livnot u'libanot, to build and be built. It doesn't take a large number of people to create a movement. Again, most of the Jews in Palestine were not idealists, but enough were. And they founded the trade unions and the political parties and so forth that eventually became a proto-government for eventually the state of Israel. Next slide. But what really matters in terms of the conflict that lives with us to this day was the decision by the British government, for reasons of its own, to support the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine as per the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which was issued largely because of a desire to have loyal clients, the idea that Jews would be helpful servants to British colonial interests. This is something that jived with Zionist desires for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. To this day, Jews the world over celebrate the Balfour Declaration as a recognition of the Jewish claim on Eretz Israel. And Muslims and Arabs throughout the world curse the Balfour Declaration as crass imperialism. Two different ways of viewing the same document. Next slide. I want to make clear that Palestine during the Mandate period, 1918, 1920, whatever, to 1948, it was not simply a story of Jewish migration, although hundreds of thousands of Jews did migrate. And it was not just a story of the development of Jewish politics and education, of Jewish factories, Jewish collective farms. That was all part of the story. It was also a time of Palestinian development. Palestinians developed their own industries. The citrus industry, by the way, was not only developed by Jews. Palestinians also had a citrus industry. They built up neighborhoods in nice cities like Jaffa and Jerusalem. So here we have Sheikh Jarrah, which was a nice neighborhood in Jerusalem, a Palestinian neighborhood, while Jews built the city of Tel Aviv, the all-Hebrew city of Tel Aviv, where I've just spent 2 weeks. And I must say, despite everything that's happening in the country, it's looking pretty good. Next slide. So Palestine, yeah, they developed their own citrus industry, they developed irrigation. Now, the Palestinians were not as well economically developed as the Jews. More Palestinians were peasants, Jews were more likely to live in the cities. The Jewish farmers, for the most part, lived either in collective farms that were quite advanced agriculturally, or they lived in citrus colonies that also used modern technology. But I simply want to point out that the Palestinians were not a mass of illiterate peasants. Literacy rates in Palestine were very similar to those of Lebanon and Syria, which were pretty high. There was a Palestinian middle class in Jerusalem and Jaffa. It is very much a story of two nations developing rapidly at the same time. Next slide. Another big controversial issue is land ownership. Jews, Zionists claim that they purchased the land of Israel fairly, often at high prices, so it was theirs. Whereas Palestinians say, actually, Jews owned very little of Palestine. And when they bought land, they drove Palestinian tenant farmers off the land. Well, the fact is that about 9% of the land in historic Palestine was bought by Jews by 1948. About 5% of its agricultural land. So yes, it's true. Jews owned very little of Palestine. Arabs owned more, maybe about 35% of Palestine. Then you might say, what's the rest? It was crown land. Ottoman land, British land. Well, here we call crown land. Much of it uncultivable. So yes, Palestinians owned more land than Jews. And there were also more Palestinians than Jews. By 1948, there were about 1.2 million Palestinians and about 600,000 Jews. So Palestinians owned more land. There were about twice as many of them as Jews, but both nations developed quite a bit economically and politically over this period. Next slide. So what are you going to do? The Palestinians are developing their own politics, their own economics, their own school systems. The Jews are developing the Hebrew language taught in their school system, raising a new generation of young people who only know what it's like to be born and raised in Palestine. That whole notion of Jews as colonials kind of falls apart when you realize that if you're born in the land of Israel and your native language is Hebrew, it doesn't really matter where your parents are from. And then you get the next generation and the generation after that. This is something that really hit hard when I was at one of my many nice dinners with friends in Israel over the last couple of weeks. The people around the table were more or less my age, so old people. Their parents had been born in Europe, or their grandparents. They had pale skins, they were Ashkenazic Jews, but they were speaking in native Hebrew about a life that they had made rooted in this country. So to call them colonials, I mean, yes, they're different from the Palestinian Arabs, to be sure. But simply to dismiss them as colonials is, I think, quite inadequate intellectually. Anyway, we have two peoples fighting over the land. Violence breaks out in Palestine between Jews and Arabs with depressing frequency. Riots in 1929 throughout the country. The British do not know what to do. because they feel an obligation to not only the Jews, but the Palestinians as well. Next slide. And the Palestinians developed politics of their own, led by this gentleman, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, head of the Supreme Muslim Council, Muhammad Amin al-Husseini, a man who's much reviled by Jews because he was a Nazi collaborator during World War II. He was also a powerful Palestinian political leader. And as a citizen of the United States, I know what it's like to live in a country that has a powerful political leader whom I might not like very much. Next slide, please. But he wasn't alone. And it's really interesting how so often when I hear about the way people in the Jewish community perceive Palestine, they know one name, Husseini, Amin al-Husseini. There were lots of Palestinian politicians of the time, the distinguished Musa al-Husseini or Rajib al-Nashashibi. I mean, these were educated, very sophisticated political figures, mayors, not people to be simply dismissed. Next paragraph. Next paragraph. You see, I'm tired. Whereas the Zionist organization had its own political leadership, its president Chaim Weizmann, David Ben-Gurion in Palestine, and so forth. Next slide. What to do with Palestine? As Palestinian Arabs begin to rebel against British rule in the mid-1930s, the British edged towards something that we've been struggling with ever since. Why don't we divide the country in half? Or more or less in half. Part for the Jews, part for the Arabs. And so this gentleman, Sir Reginald Coupland, an Oxford Don, long gone by the time you arrived, Liat, came up with the idea of partition. Next slide, please. And then I love this guy's mustache. The Royal Commission, chaired by William Robert Wellesley Peel. You know you're an important figure in Britain if you've got lots of names. Next slide. Came up with the idea to partition Palestine into a very small Jewish state, a much larger Arab state, and then a zone that would be British. Now, neither side really liked the proposal, but the point is that even in 1937, we're talking about 90 years ago almost, the British are thinking Jews and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs, whatever you call them, cannot live with each other. There needs to be some kind of partition. Next slide, please. And during the Second World War, Jews are persecuted and uprooted in Europe. The Zionist movement decides that there must be a place for them to go after the war. And in the wake of the Holocaust, when it becomes clear that 2/3 of the Jews of Europe have died, then the Zionist movement claims that there must be a safe haven for the Jews. There must be a Jewish state, as declared at the Biltmore program, or by the Biltmore program in New York City in 1942. Next slide. So the United Nations gets to work, and they decide to partition the land. Most of the UN committee debating the future of Palestine decided to divide the country in half, an Arab state and a Palestinian state. But there were a few delegates, next slide, who said, no, we want a federated state where Jews and Arabs will have to learn to get along and rule together, but there'll be a Jewish part and an Arab part, sort of like Quebec and everything else, because it worked so well in Canada. And to this day, scholars argue, what was the right thing to do? Did the UN do the right thing by recommending partition, which didn't work, right? The Palestinian state never came to be. Could there have been a federated state? Could it have possibly succeeded? Next slide. But then in 1948, it became clear that only the rule of arms, only violence would determine who controls Palestine. Next slide. Now again, we probably know about the Jewish forces in the war, the Haganah militia, but there were Arab forces as well, the Jordanian army and also the Palestinian militia, the Jaish al-Jihad al-Muqaddas and the Jaish al-Inqad al-Arabi, the Arab Liberation Army. They weren't as numerous, they weren't as well armed, but there were fighting forces on both sides. Next slide. Jordan had a particularly well trained army commanded by British forces. Next slide. The Haganah, not terribly well armed, but highly motivated. Next slide. and an elite force of Palmach, of Haganah fighters known as the Palmach. These were people who had real military training and played a very important role in Israel's victory in 1948. Next slide. Well, can't do everything now. Next slide. So the war ended. Israel won. I'll talk more about that in just a second. But what was left? Israel actually wound up conquering more territory than the United Nations had allocated to it, something which in the Arab world is well known and in the Jewish world is not as well known. Israel doubled its arable land, cultivable land, increased its total land area by about 30–40%. Next slide. What's the result of all of this? Euphoria for Jews, independence, a state, a refuge, a place to call home. But for the Palestinians, next slide, disaster, Nakba, a term that is slowly entering a political conversation in Canada and the United States as it did not, let's say, 20 years ago, that for the Palestinians, this was their dispossession, the loss of their homes and their homeland. Regardless of the circumstances of their departure, they were not allowed back. They were not allowed back. Next slide. And the United Nations proclaimed in December of 1948 that the refugees who wished to return home should be permitted to do so as long as they're willing to live in peace with their neighbors. Now, what's interesting, though, if you look at that carefully, is that many activists for the Palestinian cause say that this document conferred a, quote, right of return upon the Palestinians. It did not. That is not what the document said. It simply said they should be allowed to return if they will live at peace with their neighbors. Most of this resolution was really about what to do about Jerusalem, and every Arab state voted against it. Every Arab state voted against that statement because it implicitly recognized the state of Israel. Refugees will come back as long as they're willing to live at peace with their neighbors. So, in other words, for Arab states to invoke 194 today, or for Palestinians to invoke 194 today, is a bit odd because every Arab state at that time rejected it. Now I'm going to cut, I know that I've only gotten up to 1948, so I'm going to move fairly quickly and just cover some major points as we come to the end. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Israel in the 1950s developed an attitude that one could say exists to this day regarding the Arab world. A notion that the Arab world is irreconcilably hostile to Israel, and that the only way Israel can survive is through, as Moshe Dayan put it in a famous eulogy for a fallen Israeli in 1956, that Israel must live by the sword, ever ready to fight for all eternity. That's what Dayan said, and Benjamin Netanyahu has said the same sort of thing on several occasions. Israel must always live by the sword. Common idea in Israel, although there have been people who have rejected it. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. The state of Israel, as we know it, grew much larger in 1967 when it preemptively defeated Egypt, Syria, and Jordan and tripled its landmass. Now, the landmass gave Israel greater security, but it also unleashed something else. Next slide. It unleashed a desire to settle the conquered territories, territories that had been part of the biblical heartland of Israel, the West Bank, as we know it today, and then unleashed a settlement movement, and that also involved annexing eastern Jerusalem, and not only the old city and its environs, but about 18 Arab villages, all in what was previously the West Bank, all became part of Greater Jerusalem. So today, when we talk about Jerusalem, we talk about a much larger city than it had been before 1967. And the Jews who live in those neighborhoods in eastern Jerusalem, French Hill, Ramat Eshkol, Gilo, Ramot, they go on and on and on. Technically, they are living on what had been West Bank territory annexed by Jordan before 67. Next slide. Next slide. The Palestinian national movement was not going, in the long run, to allow itself to remain defeated. And this is another sort of controversial issue, but I think it's a lesson of history, that Israelis have thought ever since 1948 that the Palestinian issue can be resolved through force. They can be dispossessed. They can have to live outside of Israel. The Palestinian national movement developed a very strong organization centered around guerrilla groups in the late 1960s, led by Yasser Arafat, chair of the largest Palestinian faction, Fatah, and the Palestine Liberation Organization. Next slide. Next slide. And in 1973, the Arab states proved to Israel that they were also not going to simply accept defeat. And Egypt and Syria attacked the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, respectively, and they almost won. But the United States sent massive amounts of military aid to Israel, very similar to what's been happening in the last year in Israel, 20,000 tons of military equipment, without which Israel probably could not have defeated Egypt and Syria in 1973. Next slide. This is why Egypt, to this day, claims that they won the war in 1973, although Israel did beat them back and was racing towards Cairo when the war ended. Next slide. So I've only talked about bad news so far. Living by the sword, Palestinians determining to fight against Israel with violence, terrorism executed by Palestinian factions and their allies throughout the world in the 1970s. And yet Israel did make peace with Egypt in 1977 by returning the Sinai Peninsula to the country. Next slide. Under this leader, Menachem Begin, a right-wing territorial maximalist, next slide, who actually shook Anwar Sadat's hand, guided by the late Jimmy Carter, much reviled by North American Jews for his criticisms of Israel during his own lifetime, but in retrospect, much admired. Next slide. So Israel came out of the 1970s believing that the Palestinian issue can be contained. Egypt is now no longer an enemy of Israel. The problem is the Palestinians just continued to regroup and strengthen themselves. Palestinian stronghold in southern Lebanon, which they used as a base for attacks against Israel, led to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon that lasted for some 3 years. Next slide. Israel destroyed Palestinian factions in Lebanon only to inadvertently help create a new Shiite militia known as Hezbollah in 1982, which went on to then become the strongest political force in Lebanon. It's kind of like whack-a-mole or the Hydra, that no matter what Israel tried to do to contain the Palestinians, then they created more problems in the region. Next slide. And the Palestinians refused to remain quiescent. In 1987, in Gaza, at the very end of the year, Palestinians began an uprising against Israeli rule that lasted for several years. Not nearly as violent as what we've experienced over the last 15 months, but still an uprising. Next slide. And then came the great moment of hopefulness that many of you remember. It looked like it was all going to be okay. The crusty military leader, Yitzhak Rabin, Prime Minister of Israel, shook the hand of the arch-terrorist, as many Israelis saw him, Yasser Arafat, presided over by a beaming Bill Clinton, much taller than Jimmy Carter. And it looked like history was going to end, and my talk would end right here. The Palestine issue would be solved, Israel and the PLO would recognize each other. Finally, the two peoples would live at peace. Next slide. But that's not what happened. Because Israel decided to actually promote alternatives to Fatah, to the main PLO faction in Gaza and in the West Bank, favoring a religious Palestinian organization over the secular Fatah. So Israel actually helped promote the rise of Hamas beginning in the late 1980s, certainly did not persecute them the way that they fought against Fatah military forces. Next slide. This issue of the Palestinian unwillingness to simply go away has characterized the last 2 decades. Yes, Israel built more and more settlements in the West Bank. Today there is something like 700,000 Israeli Jews living in the West Bank. Yes, Israel is militarily much stronger than the Palestinians, but the Palestinians continue to make themselves heard. A second uprising in the early 2000s, much more violent than the one before, in terms of the number of Israelis killed by Palestinians and vice versa. Next slide. Israel needs to make concessions. They withdrew from Gaza in 2005. They demolished 21 Jewish settlements. And by the way, to this day, if you want to understand the anger of many of the more, I'd say, zealous settlement activists in Israel in the wake of this current war, it's because they feel betrayed by what happened in 2005. And many of them and their children want to go back. There's a very powerful movement among the Israeli far right. Next slide. In 2009, Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been prime minister longer than anyone can remember, actually spoke of Palestinian statehood. And yet he revoked that time and time again. Next slide. Israel tried to then separate itself from the Palestinians, not through territorial withdrawal alone, but by literally creating a wall or a barrier that would keep Palestinians out, keep out terrorists. And it was largely effective for many years. Next slide. But the threats continued. The Iranian regime, going back to the early 21st century, consistently threatening to destroy Israel, arming Hamas, arming Hezbollah, which continued until very recently, until the Israeli military eviscerated Hezbollah just last month, or 2 months ago, and until Israel also dealt a really crushing and embarrassing blow to the Iranian military. Again, Israel's constantly dealing with threats that refuse to go away. Next slide. But Hamas has been the most, I would say, persistent, the most violent, the most unvanquishable opponent for Israel. Time and time again, Israel has launched military incursions into Gaza. This war that started last October is, what, the 5th in a series, by far the most violent, by far the longest lasting, 15 months and counting, by far the most deadly. I know there's a lot of controversy about casualty figures in Gaza. We don't really know how many people are killed. We know the figures the Palestinian Health Ministry has provided. But by looking at satellite photographs, we can empirically demonstrate the extent of physical damage in Gaza. It is very hard to imagine there not being scores of thousands of deaths in Gaza. So again, I was talking about this with an Israeli journalist he heads the Gaza desk for Haaretz, and his job is to figure out what's actually happening in the country, because there are no foreign journalists in Gaza. The Israelis won't allow it. So they're relying on scraps of information. But it does seem to be extremely destructive and violent. Next slide. And will the Israelis finally put the Palestinian problem aside? Will the Palestinians somehow disappear? I think not. I think the Israeli Jews are not going to go away, and the Palestinians are not going to go away. At the moment, the Palestinians have certain things going in their favor. The International Criminal Court investigations, the United Nations condemnations of Israel, the arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu and the former defense minister Gallant, highly damning reports of Israel from NGOs, the boycott movement, which is quite active on university campuses, seems to be mainly affecting professors in the humanities. You know, I have colleagues in Israel who are philosophy professors who are now being disinvited from conferences as if their books on Hume are somehow contributing to Palestinian deaths, while Israelis who work in the security services can go to a meeting at the Rand Corporation or at General Dynamics with no consequence. And then there's campus activism, which we can talk about during the Q&A period. Next slide. But what are the factors in Israel's favor? And there are factors in Israel's favor. One is that the world is a messy place, and the United States and the other powerful countries in the world are really not that interested in Israel-Palestine as they are, for example, the incoming Trump administration is very concerned about China. The Biden administration was very concerned about Russia and Ukraine. I think that both the Biden and the incoming or returning Trump administration are very concerned about Iran. Syria has been effectively eviscerated, at least for the moment. But these larger issues are going to, certainly in the minds of the leaders of great powers, be more important than Israel-Palestine. Also, Israel has made inroads with the decidedly non-democratic and wealthy Gulf states through the Abraham Accords that were crafted under former returning President Trump. Israel has made inroads with Sudan, Morocco, and increasingly with Saudi Arabia. The Palestinians have no patrons in the world. With the exception of Qatar, which has financed Hamas, the Palestinians do not have patrons. Yes, they have campus activists. They do not have global patrons. Israel has degraded the military strength of Hamas, of Hezbollah, of Iran, of Syria, and despite the war of the last 15 months, despite the missiles coming from Yemen and from Lebanon and from Gaza, the fact is that Israel has been relatively secure. When you think about it, I mean, yes, Israelis have been rousted out of bed night after night by sirens. Very few missiles have actually hit Israel and caused damage. I think when I got there, a missile hit Jaffa and flattened a playground. And just after I left, like an hour after my plane took off, a Houthi missile streaked towards Israel, and they closed the airport. But for the most part, Israel has done a remarkable job ensuring the security of its citizens in the heart of the country, although Israelis are still reluctant to return to the north. And there's the ongoing tragedy of the southern communities, the communities that were destroyed on October 7th. Next slide, and with this I'm going to end. Or is that, yeah. So just to sum up, Israel then is a country that has survived and has found its way to persevere under enormously difficult circumstances. But the Palestinians have as well. The Israelis have more power. They have greater weaponry. They have more support from the United States. And yet the Palestinians themselves and the Palestinian issues are simply not going to go away. And Israel itself, for all of its military strength, is a riven society. It is a civilly, I would say, disunited society as a result of the 2022 Israeli elections that brought a far right-wing government to power, a government that attempted a judicial, they call it an overhaul, some call it a coup, that would severely limit the autonomy of the court system. In other words, to make Israel more of an authoritarian, Central European-style state. Israelis are divided about that. Next slide. And yet, and this is where the Palestinians and the Israelis consistently underestimate each other. My final point. Palestinians in 2022 and 2023 saw the demonstrations every Saturday night in Tel Aviv. They saw the dissent in Israeli society between supporters of the government and opponents, between ultra-Orthodox Jews and national religious Jews. And they said, this is a weak society. This is a society about to crumble. And they thought that the blow of October 7th would destroy that society and would also bring on an Arab onslaught from throughout the Arab and Muslim world that would destroy the state. But they were wrong. They were wrong because Israeli society, for all of its division, is remarkably sticky. It holds together, even when you think it's falling apart. But the Israelis have underestimated the Palestinians. They did not dream that Hamas would be capable of what it did on October 7th. They planned it in front of the Israelis' eyes. The Israelis could not believe that Palestinians could do something so successful as bring thousands of fighters, of guerrillas, into the country, unleashing horrific damage. Palestinians are persevering. They're persevering militarily, diplomatically, and legally. There's now a whole new generation of Palestinian academics, NGO operatives, lawyers, the kind of people who brought the Palestinian case to the International Court of Justice and to the International Criminal Court, even to the point of advocating that if Israel does annex the territories, which it might, then all the Palestinians must be made citizens. So we are dealing with two powerful movements, two nations, fighting over the same land, consistently misunderstanding each other, consistently underestimating each other. And until such time as they fail to recognize each other for what they are, I don't think there's going to be peace in the region. I'd like to think that at some point there will be that moment of recognition. Not sympathy, not love, but just an acknowledgement of the permanence of the other. I've talked for too long. I'll stop now.
We're going to shift gears now to a question and answer. Derek is apologetic. He said that if he'd give this lecture at Harvard, most people with the telephones were on their telephones halfway through. So kudos that everyone was, I think, really intently listening. So we are moving into the Q&A. We're doing the same thing we did last time with the index cards. We're getting them. Michael's clustering them into some themes, and he's passing them on to me, and I'll be asking the questions. So not all the questions will be asked, unfortunately. If you have a question, just give it to Michael. We'll go for half an hour. Are you good to 9 o'clock?
Sure.
All right.
I've already had my nap.
So the first question, in Kenneth Stern's book, The Conflict Over the Conflict, you were quoted, "Not a single one of the founding figures or the history of Zionism Israel would be allowed to speak on campus today in Hillel facility. All of them were willing to consider alternatives to pure Jewish sovereignty in Palestine. That includes Herzl, Jabotinsky, and Ben-Gurion. What does this say about Zionism and its future evolution?"
I swallow my cookie. How dare he quote me? Right. Sorry. Okay. The Zionist ideal that at least I grew up with, and probably many of you grew up with, is an idea that Jews are committed to, and from the late 1800s on, were committed to, a Jewish state, a Jewish sovereign state in the land of Israel, where Jews could be a free people, exercise control over their fate, and that depended on sovereignty. And that view was challenged beginning about, 20 years ago. Some scholars began to say, well, when you look at these early Zionist figures like Herzl and the Hada'am, Pinsker, Jabotinsky, even Ben-Gurion, they were interested in all kinds of forms of collective Jewish life in Eretz Israel that weren't necessarily sovereign statehood. Even Jabotinsky, who was an ultra-right-winger, wanted a Jewish kind of protectorate that would be part of the British Empire and that would be protected by British bayonets. He wanted Palestine to be a dominion of the British Empire, but his understanding of dominion was much more, I'd say, dependent than what the dominions really were. Right? I mean, Canada was a dominion of the British Empire. It is true that when Britain went to war in World War I, right, Canada just, like a baby duck following its mother, right? Canada just followed along. That was his vision. So that's not really complete sovereignty. Just as Canada didn't receive, didn't it? It was only the Treaty of Westminster, 1931. Yes, I'm in Canada. People know these things.
when Canada received, real sovereignty over foreign policy. So it's true that a lot of the early Zionist leaders were thinking in terms of sub-sovereignty or non-sovereignty. That's true. However, 1948 was a long time ago, right? The state of Israel is going on 80 years, or in a few years. Just, it's getting up there, 75 plus. And it's been a state for a long time, a sovereign state, army, sovereignty, the whole thing. So the fact that Herzl, Ahad Ben-Gurion thought differently before the 1930s might not really mean a whole lot. It's interesting, and historians like to talk about what's interesting, but it doesn't really determine anything. So the question is moving forward. I don't think that the people of the state of Israel want to just give up sovereignty. I can't imagine any state, population, or government just giving up sovereignty. But what it does tell us is that the word Zionism can mean lots of things. It can mean identifying entirely with a sovereign state. It can mean identifying with some kind of homeland that isn't sovereign. That is, Zionism is flexible. The meaning of the word changes over time. That, I think, is valuable. That you can say, I'm a Zionist, and that word can mean many different things to different people. But as far as the future of Israel-Palestine, this is where I part with some of my well-meaning, I think, colleagues. I don't think that the political theory of people who lived 140 years ago is going to tell me a whole lot about how the state of Israel should behave today.
Thank you. Yep. Shifting gears, the UNRWA?
Yeah, UNRWA. Yep.
Yeah, UNRWA, right. UNRWA is the biggest impediment to peace. UNRWA schools teach and hate and jihadism towards Israel and Jews. What are your thoughts about UNRWA's role in the ongoing conflict, and what should be done about UNRWA and their curriculum? And maybe do you want to describe what UNRWA is?
So it's funny about UNRWA. So the United Nations, Work Relief Organization, this is an organization that was founded in the midst of the 1948 war. And its original goal was to provide emergency relief for Palestinian refugees until the Palestinian refugee situation could be rectified, and their estimate was that that would take about 9 months. I kid you not. That was the origin of UNRWA. They were off by several dozen years, and it's still around. And it's true that UNRWA it's largely staffed by Arabs, and it definitely has staff who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, and there are accusations that UNRWA employees have actually been Hamas sympathizers or Hamas operatives, and I don't claim expert knowledge on this. I just tell people in general, don't believe what you read in the newspaper, and certainly don't believe what you read online. But I don't really know what the alternative is. The problem is that there is a humanitarian, even before this war, Gaza was a humanitarian, a really terrible situation. And so if UNRWA isn't going to provide relief and isn't going to provide educational services, then who is? I don't have an answer. Just as I think that the bigger point I made earlier, that neither Israeli Jews nor Palestinians are going to go away. So the issue of angry, hostile Palestinians in Gaza is not going to be relieved by keeping them penned up in Gaza or by obliterating scores of thousands of them. So UNRWA I think it's a symptom of a much bigger problem, and we can talk about the solutions to that problem. Perhaps that'll come up in another question.
Thank you. Shifting gears again, can you explain or expand your comment that Israel helped create Hamas? Then there's also, and I haven't read the also yet, why do big, rich Arab states not support the Palestinians? No power patrons.
Yeah. So as far as Hamas goes, Israel, like any great power, plays divide and conquer. And when Israeli operatives, security operatives, and they always have informants in the territories, and they knew what was going on. And well, this is great. Let's, for example, they could have simply arrested all of these Hamas operatives very early on. They didn't, but they did seek out, arrest, shoot or whatever imprison Fatah operatives, right? So they allowed Hamas to develop, which they thought could then be a counter to Fatah, to the main Palestinian faction. And divide and conquer is an old strategy. It's not just the Israelis who do it. Every country does it, except maybe Canada, because we can't. And the other question was about the Arab states. So this is a really interesting question. On the one hand, Arab leaders have had a historically very difficult and hostile relationship with the Palestinians. And it goes back to the 1930s because most of the Arab states were pro-Western. Farouk, king of Egypt, and Abdullah, king of Jordan, Faisal, king of Iraq. These were all people who basically were working with the British. And then we have Amin al-Husseini, who's anti-British, something of a revolutionary. And then you have the PLO, which is also a revolutionary organization and is destabilizing, like when the PLO threatened to destabilize the Jordanian monarchy in 1970. So in general, the Arab states are non-democratic, right, authoritarian, and they don't want their regimes to be overthrown by revolutionaries. And so, for example, Saudi Arabia is no friend of the Palestinians. However, there's a lot of sympathy for the Palestinians in the Arab street. That is, people in the Arab world have a tremendous amount of sympathy with the Palestinians, anger, if not hatred or rage against Israel. And Arab governments have to take that into account. You don't have to have a democracy to have to take public opinion into account. Like Egypt didn't want to go to war against Israel in 1948. Farouk figured they'd lose. Israel had a better army. But the Arab street was clearly in favor of war, and they went to war and they lost. So I think it's just very important to understand that the Arab and Muslim world has very strong feelings about Palestine. And Arab leaders, each in their own way, have to take into account of that, have to take that into account.
You talk of Palestinian resistance as a refusal to go away. But what can Palestinians do in the face of Israel, occupation and violence, to reach for statehood and sovereignty? Is there a diplomatic, just option for Palestine?
I guess it depends on how you define just. For me, yes. I think there's a just option that I have Palestinian colleagues who support this, which is a variety of the two-state option, which goes back to the 1990s. It's really interesting. I was at Wellesley College a few months ago on a panel with an Israeli commentator, a Palestinian lawyer, and an Egyptian diplomat/academic. And they're all two-staters. The Palestinian and the Egyptian all were too. They said, the problem is you cannot have peace between Israelis and Palestinians unless each side feels empowered. Each side has to feel sovereignty is a feeling as much as it is a state of being. And you only acquire that through statehood. The Palestinian-American scholar Rashid Khalidi, kind of the doyen of Palestinian historians, I remember when I saw him once, he sort of asked me, okay, so where's my state? This is something, it's a psychological issue. Now, there is an alternative that some Israelis and Palestinians have come up with called One Land for All, which is a kind of a federation in which there are two separate states, and you can be a resident of one but a citizen of only one. So you can be a Jew living in the West Bank, but you're a citizen of Israel. You can be a Palestinian living in Israel, but you're a citizen of Palestine. Basically, you have like a green card or something. Just all of these solutions are trying to square the circle of giving both peoples a sense of not just physical security, but there's something even more important than physical security. And here, Jennifer Mitzen, if you ever read her, and ontological security, one of the very few things out of IR I really learned and liked, was ontological security is that feeling that you know exactly who you are, that your identity is firm. And one thing Israelis have, even through the worst of the Hamas massacre in the last year and 3 months, they have a very strong sense of ontological security, now more than ever. The Israeli flags everywhere, and people have a very strong sense of who and what they are, regardless of their level of personal safety. Both peoples need ontological security, both peoples need physical security. ideally some kind of two-state option could provide that. There is so much animus against that option right now, particularly in university campuses, where my students say, well, there'll just be a single state where the Jews and Arabs live together in peace and harmony. And I look at them, it's like, I don't think so. But if that's what they want to explore, that's fine. I mean, I don't believe in censoring them in any way, as long as they don't get hostile or, violent towards other people. That, to me, is what I think the logical answer is. But I know I've got plenty of Palestinian colleagues who would disagree.
One more question about Palestinians,
Yeah.
and then we'll move on to a different topic. Will the Palestinians ever accept the existence of a Jewish state in the Middle East? Israel seems willing to trade land for peace. Many times this has been offered, but always rejected by the Palestinians.
I'm not sure about that narrative. The Palestinians began to talk about, I'm thinking where to start. After the 1967 war, there were attempts by Jordanian mayors, kind of local political figures, East Bank Palestinians, to talk about some kind of peace with Israel in exchange for territorial surrender, and the Israeli response was, no, we're not going to do that. In the early 1970s, some of the Palestinian factions began talk about a Palestinian state just in the territories, West Bank and Gaza, which would implicitly recognize Israel. Israel was not interested in pursuing that. I think that both sides have missed opportunities. It's often said that the Palestinians have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Israel has missed plenty too. So I'm not condemning Israel, I'm not vilifying Israel, I'm just saying that both sides have made mistakes in this regard. The most famous case is the 2000 Camp David summit, where according to a pro-Israel account, the Palestinians were offered all kinds of things and refused, and then the Second Intifada broke out. But if you actually look at the documents produced at the conference, at the summit, which some enterprising researcher has put online, you see that the Palestinians did reject American proposals, but you see the Israelis rejected them too. You see the Israeli handwriting all over the American documents. No, we can't take this, we can't accept this. The difference was very subtle. The Palestinian response to the American suggestion was no. The Israeli response was, well, I don't like it, but maybe. And the Palestinian lawyer I mentioned actually said to me, because he was on the legal team at Camp David too, he said, yeah, we should have done the same thing as the Israelis. We should have said, well, maybe, we don't like this, but instead they just said no. But actually the Israelis were very, very suspicious of a lot of what the Clinton administration was trying to force on them. So again, I think there's a certain narrative that the Palestinians have always refused Israeli offers, certainly under the prime ministership of Benjamin Netanyahu. We cannot talk about any good faith effort by the Israeli government to sustain the Palestine Authority. They've done everything they can to undermine it. So anyway, so I think we need to maybe change the narrative on that a little bit.
There are three questions here back on Zionism again, so I want to cluster them together, and I'll read them all. They're pretty short. You described yourself as a Zionist. Does this mean you support the existence of Israel as a Jewish state, and if so, why? In a nutshell, if you can. How should we define Zionism now? What does it mean to be a Zionist? And the third one, is it possible to be a Zionist and believe in the right of Palestinians to return? If yes, do we have to rethink the Zionist, anti-Zionist binary?
Those are all great questions. Because of my jet lag, I'm not going to remember them all.
Do you want me to?
Why don't you pose them one at a time?
You want to? Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Is it possible to be a Zionist and believe in the right of Palestinians to return? If yes, do we have to rethink the Zionist binary?
Okay, so for that question, I think the answer is absolutely yes. You can be a Zionist and be a chauvinist who believes that Palestinians have no right to live in the land of Israel. You can be a Zionist and believe that Palestinians have the same collective rights as Jews, and that Jews and Palestinians must find a way to live together in the land between the river and the sea. The word Zionist, I believe, is much more capacious than any particular vision of how Jews and Palestinians should live or should not live together. So now it's the third question. The first question, am I a Zionist? Yes. I'm a Zionist in the sense that, yes, I believe that Jews need and deserve a state, and I say a state, in or within Palestine, because I'd be open to some kind of two-state option. I think they have a need for it. I think they deserve it, and I also think that it exists. And that's the thing, is that what bothers me about the debate about Israel's right to exist is, like, why are we even asking this question? You know, I'm not really very happy about China. China exists, no one exists. If you look in a German, I'm trying to remember now, if you look up the phrase right to exist in Google, I think like 90 of the first 100 entries are all about Israel. And if you look up in German the term Existenzrecht, it says, oh, zum Beispiel, Israel's Existenzrecht, Israel's right to exist. Because this phrase, which has been used for other countries, I think after World War I, the phrase was used to describe, does a Yugoslav state have a right to exist, or a Czechoslovak state, or, you know, whatever. But then it failed, it went into abeyance. And now people only ask this question about Israel. So for me, Israel exists. You know, whether you like it or not, it exists. And it's a state, and it's powerful, and it has, you know, 10 million people, and that's it. Now, am I a Zionist? Yes, I'm a Zionist in the fact that I think this is a good thing, but it doesn't mean I think that Israel is, you know, everything it should be, because it's not, in my opinion. So for me, being a Zionist can mean lots of different things. This is how I define it. And I don't see it contradicts at all beliefs in Palestinian rights. But there was a second question in the middle there. There was a sandwich question.
Well, the word, yeah. You describe yourself as Zionist. Does this mean you support the existence of Israel as a Jewish state? If so, why?
Yeah, I think I answered that.
You answered that. I think you answered, how should we define Zionism now?
Okay.
What does it mean to be a Zionist?
Yeah, and that's the thing, is that to be a Zionist is to have, I think it's a very broad category. To be a Zionist is to have a fundamental belief in the justice and the need for this state to exist. But the form of the state, its relationship with the Palestinians, whether it's religious or secular, I mean, there's so many nuances. And the problem now is that the word Zionist has, in at least university discourse that I'm familiar with, essentially become akin to pedophile. It's just, they call it in Hebrew, Shem Ganai. I mean, it's like a dirty word. And that grieves me because I think the word is a description of a certain political identity that, you know, like being happy to be Canadian or French or German or whatever, and then it can lead into all kinds of directions towards chauvinism or towards cosmopolitanism.
Derek, I think in a conversation getting ready for this, we asked you about the question about JSpace, the survey where there's like 85, 90%.
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to mention that and fill it up?
So it's a really interesting thing that like 90% plus of Canadian Jews believe that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state, but only 51% or something call themselves Zionists, which means that the word Zionist has, just in the last 10 years, I believe, become specifically associated with the current regime, with its this current coalition, its views about Palestinians, about Gaza, about the West Bank. It's a particularly kind of chauvinist Zionism. And so my sense is that most Canadian Jews have some attachment to Israel, but they have, as it were, drunk the Kool-Aid that the word Zionist refers to a specifically toxic, in their view, toxic kind of approach to the Jewish state. I'd like to reclaim the word Zionism, but I don't know if I'll succeed because the forces are so powerful. And there are a lot of people, by the way, including very smart Reform rabbis and intellectuals who would just like to get rid of the word. They'd like to come up with something else. We could have a contest.
Different topic. We're about 7 minutes to 9, so maybe we can a couple more questions about this one. This is a different one. You have criticized the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is the IRA, definition of anti-Semitism. You have supported alternative definitions. Can you tell about the controversy over defining anti-Semitism and what this controversy says about divisions within the Jewish community over Israel-Palestine?
Well, it's a great question. I remember you told me this might come up, and I'm happy to talk about it. And I want to make something very clear. There's something fundamentally weird that we are having the debates about defining anti-Semitism. In all my years in academia, no one has ever asked me to come up with an elaborate definition of misogyny, or racism, or homophobia, or transphobia, or anything else. We just know what it is. Transphobia is being hostile towards trans people. Racism is being hostile towards people, you know, because of their skin color. It's obvious. Why do we have to tie ourselves up in knots to define anti-Semitism? So a colleague of mine at Harvard, former Hillel director, came up with a very simple definition. Anti-Semitism is identity-based bias against Jews. If you don't like someone, if you have a negative emotion towards someone, envy, resentment, hatred, fear, whatever, because they are Jewish, you're an anti-Semite. That's it. I mean, it's just very simple. So then why do we have these elaborate definitions? Well, when the so-called IRA definition was not invented to be a public document, it was invented to help European bureaucrats just classify anti-Semitic incidents, like, oh, you know, some storekeeper yelled at a Jewish customer in a certain way. Was that an anti-Semitic incident? So people like Ken Stern, who developed the original definition back in 2004, 2005, they weren't thinking of it as a public document. And then the IHRA got a hold of it, and it became a kind of a public document, which has been formally adopted by many governments and NGOs and sports teams and universities. So, and in some ways, there's nothing wrong with the IRA definition. In some ways, it has all kinds of intelligent comments about what it means to, you know, if you hate Jews, or if you demonize Jews, then you're an anti-Semite. The question about the IRA really has to do with Israel, and if you can be harshly critical about Israel, does that automatically make you an anti-Semite? The other definitions that have come out in the last few years, the Nexus definition, full disclosure, I'm on the Nexus task force, although I didn't write the definition, or the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, full disclosure, I did not draft it, but I was one of the first signatories and I support it. Both of these definitions are very similar in some ways to the IRA definition. They're just a little bit more careful when it comes to criticism of Israel, because Israel's a state, like Canada or the United States or Mexico or, you know, whatever. And if you have suffered, or if you feel sorry for people who have suffered because of the actions of that state, you might get very angry at that state. You might hate that state. Does that necessarily mean you are an anti-Semite? Well, sometimes yes. If you go and shoot up a school in Toronto, or firebomb a synagogue in Montreal, or, you know, drop swastikas on a synagogue, or the like, yes, you are an anti-Semite. You're a despicable anti-Semite. But if you say, you know, Israel's an apartheid state, okay, you hate Israel, fine. But my concern within the university environment is we don't even have to necessarily always determine whether something is anti-Semitic or not. We have to ask, is it appropriate behavior? So let's say somebody comes up to an Israeli student and screams in their face, you horrible Zionist pig or whatever. Okay, it doesn't matter whether or not that's anti-Semitic, it's inappropriate behavior, right? It's based on national origin. You're discriminating against someone based on their national origin. You're also being a rude son of a bitch, right? And so it's just wrong. So again, I'm not against the IRA. I'm just saying that the IRA goes into a bit of detail about Israel while at the same time leaving key issues undiscussed. There's nothing in the IRA definition about boycotts. There are people who support the IRA definition who say, well, of course it's anti-Semitic to boycott Israel. I actually know someone who says, oh no, the IRA definition would be okay if you want to boycott Israel. It's like, oh, okay. The JDA tries to be a little bit more clear about that. So I always tell my students, before you jump into an argument, just define your terms and ask yourself why you're getting into this argument in the first place. Why are we belaboring the question of definitions of anti-Semitism? Is it because we don't know what it is? I think if all things we would know is what it means to be anti-Semitic. Yeah, I think that would actually defang some of the controversy. If we just say, well, of course we know what anti-Semitism is. It's people who don't like Jews. You know, anyway.
This will be the last question. It's actually two questions that are very similar. And will the current ceasefire last for the week? And how do you think this war will end?
Oh, you got new.
I didn't write it.
You know, if I could tell the future, I would have bought Apple at its IPO, okay? Dalia Scheindlin, who's an Israeli-American analyst who writes 2 columns a week for Haaretz, she's very smart. And she wrote just now, and it's something that as soon as I heard about the agreement, I thought, oh my God, what about all these other phased agreements in Israel's history that have gone south? The whole Oslo process was based on an assumption that there would be a first phase, and then a second phase, and a third phase, and of course, we never got to phase 2 or phase 3. I'm assuming, fingers crossed, that the first phase will happen, there will be some hostages released, some troops, Israel will withdraw some troops. I am not hopeful at this time that the second phase will take place. And I can tell you, so when I got to Israel, I landed and I was immediately taken to demonstrations. So, I had dinner with friends. We went to first the democracy demonstration. Then we went to the hostage demonstration, which was quite raucous. But then the real heartbreak, we went at the end of the evening to the demonstration of hostage families, like all the families of the hostages. And you know how Israelis tend to be quite lively and convivial even at demonstrations? You could hear a pin drop at this one. And all of these young, beautiful faces of the siblings and the boyfriends and the girlfriends and the husbands and wives of these hostages, they were so deeply tragic. And yet the government has refused to heed them month after month after month. I'd like to believe this is over and that the hostages who are still alive will be returned, but I can't say with confidence because I don't have a lot of trust, to use Canadian understatement. I don't have a lot of trust in this government. But for what it's worth, I should tell you, I'll wear my feelings on my sleeve. My last 2 weeks in Israel were marvelous. I know the country's in bad shape. I know it has a lot of problems, but it's a marvelous country, and it deserves a much better government than it has. And I'm very hopeful that eventually it will.
That is the last question. I'm just going to go into thank yous now. Did you want to do any other summary statement? That was great. All right. So thank you. And I want to go through some other thank yous. I was going to thank Rabbi Elise for hosting and all that stuff, but she's been great. She's been really part of the planning committee and really engaging, and you know that last time she did a great job as well. So I will have her in here thanking her. I want to thank the planning committee. We've had lots of conversations, a lot of disagreements, some disappointments, but overall I think we did a pretty good job of these first 3. Thank you. Finally, I want to thank the DJC community by giving a little background. Many of us were at the June 13th meeting here, and it was a hard meeting. There was a lot of hard feelings. What was that? We talked about the survey that we had done as a community, and we talked about, it was a small group, and Israel, Palestine. So it was just a very hard meeting. And out of that meeting, it was evident that Israel-Palestine was landing in our community, and there was risk that we could have a very divisive time at DJC. After that meeting, many of us had conversations, and we decided, and we asked for, and the board embraced the idea of having educational series, thinking that educating together, learning together is a very Jewish approach and a very community-building approach. That's what happened, and I think it's proven. And that's why I'm thanking the DGC community for doing that. After the last session, we asked you about your experience of the first 2 sessions. The overwhelming response was that people learned something new and felt more connected to DGC. There is an appetite for coming together to learn. Some of you made yourselves available to show up, to follow up. However, I just want to tell you now that I'm not calling you because we didn't get your contact information in the survey. So there are people that maybe wondering why I'm not calling you back. It's because we didn't ask you for your information. So going forward, the Hard Conversations Planning Group We are working on a second series. We hope to have something April to June timeframe. We recognize it's a busy time with bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs, so we don't know how many we're going to be able to put together. In the meantime, watch for other engaging adult education events put on by DJC. Mike's not here, but the movie night on Saturday, this coming Saturday, is an example of really good adult education stuff. They've always picked up good movies. That is this Saturday, so if you are able to come out for that. Watch for other announcements of other community events, education events coming up in the weekly newsletter. So we have this room until 10 o'clock even. We did hear from people that they wanted to have time to mingle, so please stick around. I don't know how long Derek will be around. And I want to wrap up by reading one response from a survey person. And I did get permission, even though it was anonymous. I did talk to the person after, or I was talking to somebody, and this was their contribution. I'm so proud to be part of a community that honors diversity of experience, identity, and perspective of many things, including Israel-Palestine. While I know that DJC is not likely going to be my perfect political home in these post-October 7 times, I do want it to continue to be my spiritual and community home. For this, I need to be held, as we all do, with my beliefs and perspectives. I do not need this community to agree with me, but there needs to be a space for me here. I am so willing to hear and hold the experiences and ideas of others who may think differently from me. This is the strength and beauty of the DJC. These two events were designed to open hearts, to create generosity of spirit, to help us stand in shoes that are not our own. They offered learning and also an opportunity to reflect on what we know. They are the best of what the DJC can do, and I'm extremely grateful to the organizing committee for making these events happen. They give me the most meaningful glimmer of belonging and hopefulness for my place in the DJC since October 7th. Thank you. We're done.